Hey guys, American Pizza Books here. I am back today with another video. I'm going to be reviewing a different kind of book today. I don't know that I've ever done a review of a YA series or book on here before. I may have, I may just be blanking at the moment. But I'm going to be reviewing, get all the books up here, the Matched Trilogy by Ally Condie. You can see Matched, Crossed, and Reached, all three of them. Now, I'm not going to be reviewing each of them book by book. I'm just going to give you like my general thoughts on the series and the characters in it as a whole, and just tell you what I think and sort of give it what I think would be a good rating for myself and whatnot. But if you're looking for like an in-depth review of each book, this is probably not the video for you. But if you just want kind of a general overall review of the series, then this would be perfect. So I've had this trilogy for quite a long while. I got it a while back. I kind of went through a phase where I was reading a bunch of, YA and stuff, which I don't think is a bad thing. I like YA. Even though I'm 25 years old now, I find that every once in a while reading a YA book or a YA trilogy or series is kind of refreshing, especially after you've been reading some more complex books and whatnot, or maybe just more darker stuff. And YA can also be dark, don't get me wrong, but it's just a good palate cleanser from time to time, I find. And with this one, I decided that I'd had these for a while, and I finally wanted to, give them a shot because they'd just been on my mind for a little bit. Now, the thing about this trilogy that I've noticed is that it has very polarizing reviews. If you go on to like Goodreads or Amazon or any place like that, and you look at the reviews for the Matched Trilogy, you will find that it is very, very, very mixed. People either seem to love this trilogy or hate this trilogy. There doesn't really seem to be a whole lot of in between. Now, I'll get into what the trilogy is about. Now, it is YA dystopian, technically speaking, although I'll get into the dystopian part in a minute. But it's this world that is futuristic. It takes place after what would be considered our own world has either, gone to, has fallen, essentially, like most of these trilogies start out. And the world in this trilogy is called simply the Society. Now, the Society basically controls most, if not all, aspects of your life. It decides when you get married, it just basically decides what your career field's going to be. It pretty much decides everything for its citizens. And as opposed to a dystopian society, it's more of a utopian society more than anything, because most, if not all, diseases has been eradicated. Like cancer is no longer a thing, and for the most part, people lead pretty prosperous lives as long as you don't break the rules or go against the society or essentially commit what is treason in the society. And if you do, you become what is known as an aberration. And then if you do something else even worse, or you keep committing wrongdoings against the society, you become an anomaly. So basically, an aberration is like the first level of a bad status that you can have, and then there's like the anomaly, which is like the worst that you can be, and you essentially become an outcast from the society. And they decide how long you live. So in this trilogy, the main character, Kasha, her grandfather ends up dying at the age of 80. Everyone lives up until the age of 80. They have determined with their own data and studies that living until that age counts as a good, fulfilling, full life, essentially, and no one really lives past that. And when it comes time for someone to die, they get hooked up to hospital bed and IV and stuff. And, from what I got, they essentially kind of put the citizens down when they reach the age of 80. It's kind of screwed up, but that is the society. And that's also how they've not partially, but how they've eradicated, like things like cancer and most other illnesses and diseases. So almost every aspect of your life is controlled. The society kind of hides under the guise of, they're doing what's best for you, and they want you to have the best life possible and, the happiest life possible. And everything is perfect and decided and cushy and whatnot. And it kind of begs the question, is it really worth it to have a society that is perfect and whatnot, and where everyone mostly is more or less equal, if it comes at the cost of your own personal freedom and at the cost of being able to make your own personal choices at the end of the day. Just kind of an interesting thing. Now, inevitably, a trilogy or a series like this, it gets compared to series like, The Hunger Games. Hunger Games is really the big one that always gets compared to, kind of like when a horror novelist comes along and they get compared inevitably to Stephen King. It's kind of the same thing. The Hunger Games is essentially the Stephen King of the YA dystopia genre and the YA genre as a whole, if you really think about it. But this trilogy really isn't like the Hunger Games at all. If anything, I would say it's more similar to The Giver by Lois Lowry, or 1984 by George Orwell, or even like Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. I would say that the world is more similar to any one of those three. I would say it's probably most similar to The Giver, if you've read The Giver by Lois Lowry. I believe in The Giver, the world is called the community. It's called the community, and this is called the society. Which is what I immediately thought of when I started reading this trilogy, because it's called the society, and I thought, oh, like the community from The Giver. And it's a lot, and I believe even in The Giver, they also match people. From what I remember, I could be remembering that wrong. It's been a minute since I've read that book, but it reminded me a lot of like a more modern, like updated version of The Giver in the YA genre. But yeah, and one thing that I really liked about this trilogy was that it didn't feel juvenile, if that makes any sense. It felt like a much more mature series, given that it's in the YA genre, because a lot of the time you'll read a YA dystopian series, or even a YA fantasy series, or something in the YA genre, and it just comes across as very juvenile, and the characters are all kind of immature, and because they're teenagers, so it's kind of expected, but still, it's full of the tropes and whatnot, and characters making bad decisions for the sake of making bad decisions, and just doing stupid stuff. I didn't really get that in this trilogy. I mean, I'm sure there's a few tropes, but I mean, they're not done that badly. And with our main characters, with Kasha, who is our main character, our main heroine in this trilogy, and then Kai and Xander, those are basically our three main characters of the series. There are other characters in the series that we come across as we get in more and more into the trilogy, but all of the characters felt, well-spoken, and again, just not overly childish or silly like you'd get with other YA series or trilogies and stuff like that, which I appreciated. There's also kind of, because Kasha ends up meeting, she already knows Kai. That is like the main love interest in this trilogy. She's already known him from childhood, and she doesn't know him that well. He's a friend of hers, but she doesn't know him really that well. And then she's got her best friend, Xander. And in the beginning of this trilogy, Kasha is matched with Xander as her match. But then as the trilogy goes on, of course, the seeds of rebellion start being planted within Kasha. And one thing that another reviewer of this trilogy brought up is that in the beginning of this trilogy, the main character, Kasha, isn't really rebellious at all. In fact, she wants to be a model citizen for the society. She is very much a supporter of the society. But of course, as the trilogy goes on, as the first book goes on, and as the trilogy goes on, she starts to question things more, and eventually becomes, rebellious against the society. And I thought it was cool how the grandfather that I mentioned was really the first person to kind of plant that seed of rebellion in Kasha. And I really like that. And I really like the character of the grandfather, because he really stood out. We don't get much of him in physical form in the series, but what we do get, I thought was really impactful. And I really loved the scenes with him, and the relationship between him and Kasha I thought was really nice. And it was actually kind of emotional when he passed away. Excuse me for a minute. Yeah, I appreciate that. It wasn't kind of just, oh, the mysterious guy that starts right on the rebellion. It was actually like a member of her family who encouraged her to think outside the box and make her own choices and stuff. I thought that was cool. Another big theme in this trilogy is poetry. Now, personally, I'm not much of a poetry guy, but I did appreciate how it was interwoven into the story in this trilogy, and how it was also used to describe the mindsets of the characters and the situations they were going through and the choices that they had to make. I thought that was really cool, and I thought the writing was also really nice. You know, it's not going to win any literary awards or anything, but I thought that the writing for a YA series was actually really, really nice. Very poetic as well. I liked a lot of the descriptions and stuff. Excuse me. But, yeah, no, the writing was really nice. And overall, like I said, it didn't feel too overly immature, childish for a YA series. I really like the characters. I kind of discussed them a little bit already, but I like the characters. I like the character development over the course of the trilogy. It was really interesting getting to learn about Kai's backstory and just all the stuff that he's been through, because he's been through quite a lot. And the thing that Kasha realizes is that, you know, she starts to realize that she's kind of had this perfect life where she hasn't really had to go through much of anything, whereas Kai has had this, like, just awful, horrible life upbringing with the fate of his parents and whatnot, that you learn more about as you go on, because in the second book you get a point of view from Kai, and then in the third book you get a point of view from not only Kai but Xander as well. But the character development was really, really well done. I really appreciated it, and I liked all the characters, and that's another thing. The love triangle in this trilogy, it really wasn't a love triangle that much. I mean, it technically is, but halfway through the first book, even, you know like who Kasha is going to end up with, and you know who she's chosen, you know. And so it really isn't a love triangle. And another thing that I liked was that Xander and Kai, who are the two kind of love interests, they are already friends with one another, and they already know one another, and you actually see them supporting one another throughout the trilogy, which was really cool. So it's definitely not one of those silly cases of, you know, a girl has two guys, and the two guys are being just stupid and, like, fighting each other for the girl and whatnot. It wasn't anything like that at all. It was very, very handled very well, very mature, and I liked that. I liked how all three of them supported one another in their own way, and I thought that was really cool. And the pacing, that's another thing I wanted to talk about. The pacing of this trilogy is, with the second book especially, I would say it's slow. And I would say the pacing overall for this trilogy is probably somewhat slow. I wouldn't say the first book is... It's not slow, but these books aren't fast-paced. You know, they aren't your action-packed, fast-paced books full of, you know, badassery and stuff like that. You know, none of these characters are, you know, swinging swords around or shooting arrows or shooting guns and pulling a bunch of, you know, badass fighting moves and stuff like that you get with other YA series. You know, these characters are very much just like just everyday people, you know. I mean, they've all got their specialties and whatnot and their talents, but you don't really see them fighting in combat and stuff like that. And it is very much a character-driven story where you are sort of getting the inner monologues of each character and the dilemmas that they're going through and the choices they have to make and their inner thoughts, inner struggles, which was really nice. So it is, again, very much a character-driven story, and it's not super, you know, fast-paced, action-packed, whatever, you know. So if you're looking for a YA series that is that, this probably won't be the one for you. However, if you don't mind a slower pace overall, then you probably might enjoy this trilogy. But I think that's one of the things, that's one of the reasons why this trilogy has such mixed reviews, is because I've seen a number of reviews saying that nothing happens throughout the trilogy, or that nothing happens in the first book, or, oh, nothing happens in the second book, and it's so slow and stuff. And slow. Just because a book has a slower pacing doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad or that nothing interesting is going on. At least to me. And a lot does happen in these books. It just doesn't happen in a fast-paced, action-packed way. Like, there are revelations throughout the trilogies. There are, like, realizations and choices that the characters make and sacrifices. So obviously a lot is happening. It's just not happening in the stereotypical way that you would see in other YA trilogies in this genre, like in The Hunger Games or Divergent or The Maze Runner or any other series like that. So again, if you don't mind, kind of an overall slower pace, then you might enjoy this trilogy. Personally, I didn't think that the first. I can see this. I can see with the second book, it is kind of like that kind of second book syndrome sort of thing. But I didn't think in the first book or even in the third book that the pacing was necessarily slow, because there was a lot happening. It's just that when you are getting reading in the character's POV, again, it's not a bunch of action-packed fighting. There are a few scenes here and there like that, but for the most part, it's just them, going about the situation that they're in currently. And again, you get a lot of their inner thoughts and questions and monologues and stuff. So again, I think the pacing is kind of the thing that gets this trilogy sort of mixed reviews a little bit. But if you don't mind that, then you might not mind this trilogy. And then also a final point that I want to make is that this, I think another reason for the mixed reviews for this trilogy is kind of because of comparisons to The Hunger Games. And I think because the first book in this trilogy came out in 2010, and then the second book came out in 2011, and the final book came out in 2012, which was like the height of YA dystopia and YA futuristic series. And I think 2012 was when the first Hunger Games movie came out, and that movie kind of sparked the futuristic dystopia movies that followed. So I think that this trilogy came out at the wrong time, really, when it seemed like when you had the Hunger Games, and you kind of had all of these other series in the same genre. And some of them weren't nearly as good, and some of them were just clearly trying to copy the success of the Hunger Games. And I think that this one kind of got thrown in to that sort of category, when really I don't think that that's what it was at all. Because again, I think that this trilogy is actually very, very different from the Hunger Games. The only thing that it has in common with the Hunger Games is that it's a futuristic world. And of course, naturally, there are themes of rebellion in it. But other than that, it's very, very different. And I know that the Hunger Games, a lot of people compare that one to Battle Royale. And I suppose that you could get comparisons from other, like the ones that I've named, like 1984 and books like that. But honestly, I would say that this one, like I said, this trilogy especially shares way more in common with, like I said, The Giver, Fahrenheit 451 in 1984, with the way the worlds work and stuff like that. So I think that because of that, it sort of gets lumped in with sort of those lesser, YA futuristic series, as sort of kind of like a cash grab in the wake of the Hunger Games. I don't think that's what this is at all. I think it's very different from the Hunger Games. And I think that if you put those comparisons out of your mind, you'll be able to enjoy this one, or at least see it for what it is. And, what I also liked about this trilogy is that the rebellion group, which is called The Rising, and you learn about them, I don't know if they're brought up in the first book, but you definitely learn about them in the second book, and then you get to see them in the third book. And what I liked about The Rising was that even though they're supposed to be a group against the society, you can still see that even with the Rising, there is corruption. They do have somewhat of an authoritarian agenda, the same way society does. And, there are characters who even say that the Rising is really just, the society with some with some, different things here and there. Like, they want to change some things, but there's still kind of society, you know? So I really appreciated the grayness there, because it shows you that even with a rebellion, there's some flaws as well. Like, sometimes it doesn't have to be, you know, the establishment good and the rebellion, or the establishment bad and the rebellion good. You know, there can be some bad aspects to a rebellious group or a rebellion. Just like even with an establishment, there can be a lot of bad things, but there can also be some good things too, even with an establishment. So, again, just thought that was another interesting thing. But overall, I really enjoyed this trilogy. I'm glad that I gave it a chance. Overall, I would say, because I would say I'd probably give it like a 4.5 out of 5. There were some questions that I had at the end. There were a few characters that were brought up throughout the series, but you never really got to find out how they ended up, or what ended up happening with them, or where they were at, or if they were even alive. So there were some questions that I had still that didn't really get answered, but you know, it is what it is. I guess it's left up to the reader's interpretation. But other than that, I really enjoyed this trilogy. I would give it, I'd say, a solid 4.5 out of 5. Admittedly, even though I kind of said the whole thing about the pacing in the second book, it did bring things down a little bit. But nonetheless, I still felt that the second book was a good installment, and that it brought a lot to the trilogy overall. So I'd say 4.5 out of 5. Not quite a 5 out of 5, but still pretty close. And like I've said before, you know, when I'm rating books and stuff, I don't really rate it on whether, you know, the writing is really, really like literary and fancy and whatnot. And of course, ratings and enjoyment is subjective. So there's probably someone out there who absolutely hates this trilogy and probably would completely disagree with me. But in my own subjective opinion, I enjoyed this trilogy, and I'd give it the rating that I did. So, you know, again, I pretty much rate books and series on enjoyment. So, anyways, that's pretty much it for this one. If any of you out there have read the Matched Trilogy, let me know what you guys think of it. Did you like it? Did you hate it? Were you kind of in the middle? Were you kind of anywhere in between those things? Like, let me know below. And yeah, so that's it for this one, and I'll talk to you guys later. Peace. Keep on reading.